Somewhere around 2 million years ago, your ancestors made a strange evolutionary bet. They gave up almost all of their body hair. Every other ape on the planet is covered in thick fur, but somewhere along the way, humans went nearly naked. And yet, if you look at half the male population walking around today, there's a thick patch of hair growing right on the face. So here's the question that should honestly bother you more than it does. If evolution spent millions of years stripping the fur off our bodies, why did it leave the beard behind? Why does a trait that seems to work against everything evolution was trying to accomplish still exist on roughly half of our species? Today we're going to answer that, and the real explanation is stranger, more violent, and more hormonal than you probably expect. Before we get into it, a quick note on where this is going. This isn't going to be a shave versus don't shave video. This is a real dive into evolutionary biology, hormones, anthropology, and even a surprisingly recent scientific study that involved researchers hitting fake skulls with a weight to test a theory. Yes, that really happened, and we'll get to it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your body made the choices it made, and why the beard survived one of the biggest hair purges in mammalian history. If you're into videos that actually explain the why behind the human body instead of just repeating trivia, this channel is going to be a good fit, so stick around. Let's start with the bigger mystery, because you can't understand the beard until you understand why we lost our fur in the first place. Every one of our closest relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, is covered in dense hair from head to toe. Humans are the outlier. We are, biologically speaking, one of the most hairless mammals on the planet, right up there with whales, elephants, and naked mole rats. That is a strange club to belong to. So what happened? The leading explanation among researchers today comes down to one word: heat. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, our ancestors started moving out of shaded forests and into hot, open grasslands. Walking and eventually running long distances under direct sun creates a massive overheating problem. Most mammals cool down by panting, like a dog on a hot day. Humans evolved a completely different system instead. We developed millions of sweat glands, somewhere between 2 and 4 million of them, spread across almost the entire body. These glands release watery sweat directly onto bare skin, and that sweat evaporates incredibly efficiently, pulling heat away from the body in the process. Here's the catch, though. Sweat only works well if it can actually reach the air and evaporate. Thick fur traps that moisture close to the skin and blocks the airflow, which makes sweating far less effective. So the theory goes that early humans who happened to have less body hair could cool down faster while hunting or traveling in the heat of the day, while their more furry relatives had to rest in the shade to avoid overheating. That cooling advantage meant more successful hunting, more calories, more survival, and eventually, more offspring. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that advantage compounded, and the fur genes got dialed down across almost the entire body. There are other theories floating around too, like reducing parasites such as ticks and lice. But thermoregulation is the one with the strongest evidence behind it today. So by this point, our ancestors are basically walking, sweating, heat-dissipating machines with bare skin almost everywhere. Which brings us to the obvious contradiction sitting right in the middle of every man's face. If losing body hair was such a massive evolutionary win, the beard should not exist. A beard traps heat. A beard traps moisture. A beard is, biologically, working directly against the exact cooling system we just spent 2 million years building, and it's not spread evenly either. It's concentrated specifically on the lower half of the male face and it shows up specifically at puberty, specifically in men. That's not a random leftover patch of fur that evolution simply forgot to remove. When a trait is that specific, that hormonally triggered, and that unevenly distributed between sexes, biologists immediately suspect it's doing a job. So the real question isn't, why didn't the beard disappear? The real question is, what is the beard actually for? And it turns out there isn't just one answer. There are several overlapping theories, and modern research suggests the truth is probably a combination of all of them working together. The first explanation goes all the way back to Charles Darwin himself. In 1871, Darwin published a book called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, where he introduced the idea of sexual selection. Sexual selection is different from ordinary survival-based natural selection. It explains traits that don't necessarily help an animal survive longer, but do help it attract a mate or outcompete rivals for one. Think of a peacock's tail. That giant, heavy, brightly colored tail doesn't help a peacock survive. If anything, it makes the bird slower and easier for predators to catch. But peahens are drawn to it, so the trait keeps getting passed on anyway. Darwin looked at human beards through that same lens. His idea was that ancestral women may have found bearded men more attractive, and that preference, generation after generation, kept the trait alive even as the rest of our body hair vanished. It's a clean, simple explanation, and it fits the basic pattern of sexual selection perfectly. But here's where it gets messy. When modern researchers actually tested this theory across different cultures, the results were inconsistent. Some studies found that women rated bearded faces as more attractive. Other studies found the opposite, with a preference for clean-shaven faces. There's no single universal rule, and a lot of the early research only surveyed Western participants, which makes it hard to draw a global conclusion. So mate attraction alone probably isn't the full story. Which pushes us toward a second, less romantic theory. If beards weren't consistently winning over women, researchers started asking a different question. What if the beard wasn't evolving to attract a mate at all? What if it was evolving to intimidate rivals instead? This is technically still sexual selection, but it operates through a different channel, called intrasexual competition, meaning competition between members of the same sex, rather than intersexual attraction between the sexes. Across the animal kingdom, plenty of traits exist purely to make one male look bigger, tougher, or more dangerous to other males, regardless of whether females find it attractive at all. Lions have manes, elk have thick neck fur, and research on human beards has consistently found something interesting. When people are shown bearded faces next to clean-shaven versions of the exact same men, the bearded versions are rated as older, stronger, more dominant, and more aggressive-looking. That perception shift is significant, because in a world without weapons, courts, or police, physical intimidation was directly tied to survival and status. A man who looked more dominant could deter physical challenges before they even happened. He could win access to resources, territory, and mates simply by looking like the wrong guy to fight. And a beard makes the jaw look wider, the face look bigger, and the overall silhouette look heavier and more threatening. So instead of the beard being a beauty tool aimed at women, this theory frames it as a warning label aimed at other men. And that idea connects directly into one of the strangest, most literal pieces of beard research to come out in recent years. In 2020, a team led by biomechanist David Carrier at the University of Utah published a study with a genuinely wild premise. What if the beard isn't just a visual signal at all, and it's actually functioning as physical armor? Specifically, armor against punches to the jaw. The idea, sometimes called the pugilism hypothesis, starts from a simple observation. The human jaw is one of the most commonly injured bones in interpersonal violence, and it happens to be uniquely vulnerable in males, whose faces are generally more robust than females, but who also engage in far more physical confrontation throughout human history. To test whether hair could actually absorb impact, the researchers built a kind of synthetic testing rig. They created faux skin over a bone-like base and covered some samples with sheep fleece, styled to resemble the density and pattern of a human beard, while leaving other samples bare. Then they dropped a weight onto both surfaces to simulate the force of a punch, and measured how much energy each surface absorbed before impact reached the base layer. The bearded samples absorbed significantly more energy than the bare samples. In other words, the hair-covered surface cushioned the blow more effectively, similar to the way padding works in a boxing glove. Now, this doesn't prove beyond doubt that beards evolved specifically for this reason, and plenty of scientists have pushed back on how directly the study can be applied to real human faces and real punches. But it does add serious weight to the idea that a beard isn't purely decorative. It suggests that in a species where males frequently competed physically for status, mates, and resources, a bit of extra padding on one of the most commonly struck areas of the body could genuinely provide a survival edge. Combine that with the intimidation factor from the last section, and you get a trait that does two jobs at once. It makes you look tougher, and it might actually make you tougher if things escalate. None of these theories matter without the biological mechanism that actually turns the beard on, and that mechanism is entirely hormonal. Beard growth is controlled by androgens, which are a class of hormones responsible for developing and maintaining male characteristics. The main hormone involved is testosterone, but the real trigger for facial hair specifically is a more potent derivative called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT, which your body converts from testosterone using an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase. Before puberty, the hair on a child's face is extremely fine, short, and barely pigmented, technically called vellus hair. Once androgen levels spike during puberty, that vellus hair on the jaw, chin, and upper lip transforms into thick, coarse, deeply pigmented terminal hair, which is what we recognize as a beard. This is exactly why beards show up specifically at puberty and specifically in men, because it is directly wired to the same hormonal system responsible for muscle growth, a deepening voice, and broader shoulders. In other words, a beard is essentially a visible, walking readout of a man's androgen exposure. It's an honest signal, in evolutionary terms, meaning it's difficult to fake. Because you can't just decide to have more androgens. Your body either produces them at a certain level or it doesn't, and the beard grows accordingly. That's actually a big deal in evolutionary biology, because signals that are cheap or easy to fake tend to get ignored over generations, while signals tied to a genuinely costly, hard-to-fake biological process tend to stick around, because they reliably communicate real information about the individual carrying them. This naturally raises the next question. Women also have hair follicles capable of producing terminal hair on the face, so why doesn't the same thing happen to them? The short answer is estrogen. While men experience an androgen surge at puberty, women's hormonal profile is dominated by estrogen, which actively suppresses the transformation of facial vellus hair into thick terminal hair. This is also why unusually high androgen levels in women, sometimes linked to certain medical conditions, can result in visible facial hair growth, which is direct evidence of the same underlying mechanism operating differently based on hormone levels, rather than some entirely separate system. So the beard isn't a leftover trait that only men happen to keep. It's an active, hormonally enforced difference, deliberately switched on in one sex and deliberately suppressed in the other. And in evolutionary terms, that kind of built-in, sex-specific switch is a strong signal that the trait is doing real work, whether that's signaling maturity, dominance, protection, or some blend of all three. On top of the biology, there's a cultural layer that has reinforced the beard's meaning for thousands of years of recorded history. In ancient Egypt, a false ceremonial beard was actually strapped onto pharaohs, including female ruler Hatshepsut, specifically because it symbolized authority and divine power. In ancient Greece and Rome, beards were closely tied to philosophy, wisdom, and masculinity, to the point where shaving off a man's beard was sometimes used as a public punishment or humiliation. Across many warrior cultures, from Vikings to certain Middle Eastern and South Asian traditions, a full beard was directly tied to honor, and cutting it could be treated as an act of war or deep disrespect. Even today, in boardrooms, on movie posters, and across social media, a well-groomed beard still gets coded as more mature, more rugged, and more authoritative in a lot of contexts, even though plenty of people prefer clean-shaven looks too. None of this proves the biology, but it does show something important. The signals sent by testosterone, dominance, and maturity that evolution built into the beard got picked up and amplified by human culture for thousands of years afterward. Biology built the tool, and culture kept sharpening it. And that cultural reinforcement makes the trait even stickier, because now it's being selected for both biologically and socially at the same time. There's also a set of quieter, more practical theories worth mentioning before we wrap this up. Some researchers have pointed out that a beard may offer a small amount of protection from ultraviolet radiation on a face that would otherwise be almost completely bare of hair. Others have suggested it may help filter airborne particles, allergens, or pathogens before they reach the mouth and nose, similar in concept to nasal hair or eyebrows, though the evidence here is much thinner than the dominance and armor theories. There's also a pheromone-related idea floating around in some research circles, suggesting facial hair could trap and slow the release of scent-based chemical signals produced by glands near the face, though this one remains speculative and hasn't been firmly established. None of these smaller theories are considered as strong or well-supported as sexual selection, dominance signaling, or the impact protection research, but they're worth knowing about, because they show just how many angles scientists have approached this question from. The honest scientific position right now is that no single theory fully explains the beard on its own, and that's actually a more interesting answer than a tidy, single-cause explanation would have been. There's one more piece of this puzzle that rarely gets talked about, and it has to do with how differently beards grow across different populations. Genetics play a huge role in how thick, how fast, and how evenly a beard fills in, and that variation exists across every population on Earth, from thick, full coverage in some groups to naturally sparser growth in others. Researchers studying this variation generally point back to the same explanation we've already covered, meaning local differences in ancestral mate preferences, dominance dynamics, and hormone sensitivity, all left slightly different genetic fingerprints depending on where a population's ancestors lived and who they were competing with. This is also why you can't judge someone's overall testosterone level just by looking at how thick their beard is. Beard density is heavily influenced by how sensitive an individual's hair follicles are to DHT, not simply by how much testosterone is floating around in the bloodstream. Two men can have very similar hormone levels and end up with completely different amounts of facial hair, purely because their follicles respond to those hormones differently. That's an important distinction, because it means the beard isn't a perfect one-to-one gauge of masculinity or dominance in a strict biological sense, even though it's often treated that way culturally. It's closer to a rough, imperfect signal shaped by both hormone levels and genetic sensitivity working together. It's also worth pointing out how recent a lot of this beard research actually is. For most of the 20th century, facial hair wasn't taken very seriously as a subject of scientific study, and it was often dismissed as a trivial or purely cosmetic trait not worth deep investigation. That started shifting once researchers realized how directly beards connect to bigger questions in evolutionary biology, like how sexual selection actually operates in humans, how dominance hierarchies form without violence, and how hormones shape visible traits over a lifetime. Once scientists like Barnaby Dixon began running structured cross-cultural studies instead of relying on small single-country surveys, the picture became much clearer, even if it's still not fully settled today. That's actually a pretty common pattern in evolutionary biology. A trait looks simple and obvious on the surface, but the moment researchers actually dig into the mechanism behind it, it turns out to be tangled up with hormones, competition, signaling theory, and thousands of years of cultural reinforcement all at once. The beard is one of the clearest examples of that pattern hiding in plain sight on half the human population. So let's zoom back out and answer the original question directly. Why do men still have beards if humans lost almost all their fur? The honest scientific answer is that it's probably not just one reason. It's a stack of overlapping advantages that all point in the same direction. Losing body hair helped our ancestors survive brutal heat by unlocking efficient sweat-based cooling. But on the face specifically, hormonal signals tied to male puberty kept a patch of that old hair system switched on, because it turned out to be useful in an entirely different way. It may have helped signal maturity and health to potential mates, even if that effect wasn't universal or guaranteed. It very likely helped signal dominance and intimidate rival males before a fight ever needed to happen. And there's real experimental evidence that it may have physically cushioned one of the most frequently struck bones on the human body during actual physical conflict.
Stack an honest hormonal signal, a social intimidation tool, and a literal piece of biological armor on top of each other, and you get a trait that easily earns its metabolic cost, even while the rest of the body was busy going bare for the sake of staying cool. Evolution rarely keeps a trait around for one single tidy reason. It keeps traits around when they're doing multiple jobs at once, and the beard is a textbook example of exactly that. So next time someone tells you a beard is just leftover fur that evolution never got around to cleaning up, you'll know that's not really accurate. It's closer to the opposite. It's a trait that evolution actively kept turned on, wired directly into male hormones, because across thousands of generations, it kept paying for itself. If this kind of deep dive into the biology behind everyday things is your thing, this channel covers a lot of ground just like this, and the best way to catch the next one is to hit subscribe right now before you go anywhere. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think beards evolved more for attracting a mate or more for intimidating other men? I'll be reading through the comments and pinning the best takes. And if you want to see the next video, where we break down another strange leftover of human evolution, there's one right on your screen right now. So go ahead and tap it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.